My name is Camille Foster, and for the last 8 years, I lived and breathed for my career. At 36, I was the youngest senior account director at one of the largest marketing firms in New York, Stanton and Lowell. I didn't come from connections, money, or Ivy League polish. I clawed my way up from a tiny agency in Ohio, surviving on nothing but caffeine, ambition, and the kind of grit you don't learn in business school. I was always the first in, last out. I managed multi-million-dollar portfolios like they were my own, made impossible deadlines look easy, and rebuilt broken client relationships that even my male counterparts had given up on. I had just wrapped a record-breaking campaign for a tech startup that earned the agency its biggest quarterly revenue spike in 5 years. That alone should have secured me the 6-figure performance bonus I'd been promised. My supervisor, Daniel Kirkland, the type of executive who wore designer shoes and took credit for everyone else's work, stood in the boardroom 2 months ago and told me in front of the senior team, "Camille, your bonus this year will reflect the incredible value you bring to this company." Those words weren't just casual praise, they were a verbal commitment, one I immediately followed up with a thank you email that he responded to with a digital thumbs up. I had it in writing. But the thing about corporate culture is that it teaches you to never get too comfortable, no matter how hard you work or how many accolades you rack up. I should have listened to that gut feeling that told me something was off when Daniel started avoiding one-on-ones with me in the final weeks of Q4. Or when HR, out of nowhere, asked me to update my emergency contact form. I chalked it up to end-of-year admin cleanup. The final straw, or maybe the first real sign, came 5 days before bonuses were due to hit. I was in the middle of preparing a pitch deck for a billion-dollar pharmaceutical client when I got a calendar invite labeled, HR, meeting with Camille Foster. Conference room B. Just HR. No context. No details. I laughed to myself as I clicked accept, thinking maybe it was about our health insurance benefits changing again. I had no idea that in 20 minutes, my entire professional identity would be ripped out from under me like a cheap rug. When I walked into that glass-walled conference room, Daniel was already seated, along with Erin from HR. Her presence immediately made my stomach drop. She smiled like a funeral director trying to put you at ease. Daniel looked everywhere but at me. Erin handed me a manila folder across the table and said, "Camille, I'm afraid this is a termination notice effective immediately." My throat closed. I opened the folder, half expecting this to be a mistake, some kind of paperwork error. But it was real. Termination. No cause given. No warnings. Just boilerplate HR language and a blank stare from the man who, weeks ago, had been shaking my hand in front of clients like I was the company's golden child. I asked why. Erin glanced at Daniel. He cleared his throat and said, "It's a restructuring decision. Nothing personal." I had to laugh. Restructuring? They just onboarded 2 new junior associates last week under my department. I managed more clients than anyone else in the building. It was personal. But I didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me cry, rage, or beg. I stood, calmly gathered the folder, and said, "You'll be hearing from me." As I walked out of that office for the last time, my blood was boiling, not just from anger, but clarity. They had fired me 5 days before my bonus was scheduled to hit. The bonus I earned. The bonus that was contractually promised based on performance metrics I had crushed. They knew exactly what they were doing. Stanton and Lowell had a history of pulling stunts like this, getting rid of high-cost employees right before payout season, masking it as restructuring, knowing that most people didn't have the fight, or the proof, to take them to court. But what they didn't realize was that I was the wrong person to screw over. I kept receipts. Emails. Performance reports. Bonus structure agreements. Praise from executives in writing. I had a digital folder labeled CYA that I updated religiously. I never trusted Daniel, not entirely. Something about his too easy smiles and "I'll take care of it" promises always made me keep an extra copy of everything important, just in case. This wasn't just a firing. It was theft. A calculated, cowardly move to avoid paying a woman what she had earned. But they didn't just fire Camille Foster, they awakened a side of me that no one in that company had ever seen. I wasn't just going to get what they owed me. I was going to make sure they remembered my name long after they shredded my employee file. And when I was done, they would pay triple. The first 48 hours after I got fired were a blur of emotion, disbelief, humiliation, rage. I didn't eat. I barely slept. I couldn't stop replaying that meeting in conference room B, the coldness in Daniel's voice, the way Aaron wouldn't meet my eyes, how they packaged 8 years of loyalty and excellence into a single page of legal jargon and a forced apology. But after the initial sting faded, what remained was something sharper. Focused. Clean. I wasn't just angry anymore, I was ready. I took out my laptop, opened the CYA folder I had been quietly building for years, and began to organize everything into a legal timeline. I knew my rights. I'd studied enough corporate law to understand that in New York, a verbal promise, if documented and supported, can hold legal weight, especially if connected to performance metrics and compensation. My goal wasn't revenge just yet, it was justice. But deep down, I wanted them to hurt. Not emotionally. Financially. In the only language people like Daniel and Stanton and Lowell understood, liability and public exposure. Inside that folder were months of emails. One from Daniel in October congratulating me on exceeding all Q4 revenue expectations. Another from our CFO mentioning that Camille's bonus will be our largest this year, well deserved. A digital copy of the company's incentive policy that clearly stated bonuses were paid based on individual performance, not employment status at the time of disbursement. That line would become the linchpin of everything. I even had a recorded Zoom call, legal in New York, where one-party consent applies, where Daniel said, "Don't worry about the bonus, it's guaranteed. You earned it." It wasn't a smoking gun. It was an arsenal. On day 3, I called a woman named Layla Hines, a friend of mine from grad school who now worked as an employment attorney. She was the kind of lawyer who didn't blink when staring down Fortune 500 legal departments. Layla listened quietly as I laid out everything. Then she whistled and said, "Camille, this isn't just breach of promise. This could be wrongful termination, retaliation, and bad faith. They screwed with the wrong one." That was all I needed to hear. Within days, Layla filed the necessary paperwork to initiate a formal demand letter, essentially putting Stanton and Lowell on notice. The letter laid out every documented promise, the timelines, the earned bonus, and our demand for full compensation plus damages. But Layla didn't stop there. She made it clear we were prepared to go to court. That part was strategic. Most companies panic at the idea of public litigation, especially when the plaintiff is a woman of color with receipts, a spotless record, and a compelling paper trail. Predictably, the firm's in-house legal team responded with faux concern and denial. "We appreciate Ms. Foster's contributions," their letter began, "but deny any wrongdoing." They claimed the bonus wasn't guaranteed, that restructuring decisions are complex, and that no individual had been targeted. Standard legal deflection. But I could tell from the tone, they were worried. If they thought I'd fold or settle quietly for some severance crumbs, they didn't know who I was. I hadn't worked myself to exhaustion for almost a decade just to be brushed aside like a disposable intern. I wanted my bonus, my damages, and an apology on record. But most of all, I wanted accountability. They had fired me to cut costs, thinking I'd go away quietly like the last 2 women who were let go before bonuses hit. But this time, they'd picked the wrong scapegoat. While Layla handled the legal paperwork, I started quietly reaching out to former coworkers, women I trusted. One of them, Neena Patel, had been in a similar position last year. She was a rising star in the analytics department, praised at the annual review, and then mysteriously let go in early January. She never fought it. She was burned out, scared, and just wanted to move on. But when I told her what happened to me, there was a long silence on the phone. Then she said, "Camille, they did the exact same thing to me. Same week. Same vague HR memo. I thought it was just me." That was the moment it clicked. This wasn't a one-time betrayal. This was a pattern. With Nina's help, I began compiling a list of others who had been pushed out in the same way, top performers, mostly women, often women of color, all fired right before compensation season. The evidence was circumstantial at first, but as the names added up, so did the timing, late December to early January, every year, like clockwork. It wasn't just about saving money. It was systemic bias, wrapped in corporate jargon and executed with surgical precision. This wasn't just my battle anymore, it was bigger than me. A week later, Layla and I sat across from Stanton and Lowell's legal team during a preliminary mediation. I wore a deep green blazer, the same color I wore the day I signed my last $1 million client. I kept my voice calm, professional, unshaken. They expected me to plead for my job back or accept a small settlement just to make it all go away. Instead, I watched their lead attorney squirm as Layla slid a printed transcript of Daniel's bonus promise across the table, followed by a chart mapping out every performance metric I exceeded and every other high-performing woman let go the same week. Their faces changed. Slight panic. Then silence. They knew. They knew this wasn't just a lawsuit, it was a potential PR nightmare. By the end of the meeting, they asked for time to reassess. Which meant they were regrouping. Internally debating whether to cut a check or fight me in public. I was fine with either. I already had a friend at a business media outlet who'd agreed to run a feature, pending legal clearance, about corporate bonus theft targeting women. It wasn't blackmail. It was visibility. If they wanted this to stay quiet, they'd pay. Not just my bonus, but triple. By the time Stanton and Lowell asked for time to reassess, I already knew I had them in a chokehold. But instead of waiting around to see what half-hearted offer they'd slide across the table, I stayed busy, very busy. I wasn't just building a legal case anymore. I was building a pattern. A corporate narrative. A domino trail of women who'd all been silenced, discarded, or gaslit into thinking their terminations were about performance or restructuring when really, it was about saving a few $100,000 in year-end payouts. That was the real game, and now, I was playing it better than them. I spent the next week gathering statements, not affidavits yet, just informal testimonies. Phone calls. DMs, quiet coffee meetings. What started as a list of 5 former employees quickly grew to 14. 14 women, all high performers, all fired or restructured out between December 15 and January 15 over the past 6 years. I organized their stories into a spreadsheet that could make a journalist salivate: timelines, roles, performance reviews, promised bonuses, final dates of employment. It was almost surgical, the way the firm had purged them under the radar. It wasn't incompetence, it was a strategy. And it worked, until me. Layla and I met again in her glass-walled office in Soho. She reviewed the spreadsheet, looked up at me, and said, "You just proved a systemic pattern. Camille, this isn't just wrongful termination anymore. This is class action territory." Those words lit something in me I didn't know existed, not just the hunger for justice, but the appetite to lead. To make a dent in a system that had always found ways to keep women second tier, no matter how excellent we were. I'd worked too hard, played by every rule, and still been discarded like my work, my worth, was seasonal. We filed an amendment to our original demand. Now it wasn't just about my bonus or even triple damages. It was about accountability for all the women who had been quietly pushed out in the same exact way. We weren't suing just for money anymore. We were suing for change. I could see the panic setting in behind the corporate walls. Their next move was so predictable it made me laugh. They tried to discredit me. An anonymous article appeared on a business gossip blog 2 days later with the headline, "Former exec fired for misconduct threatens lawsuit." It was vague, poorly written, and clearly planted. But that smear attempt backfired spectacularly. My LinkedIn inbox flooded with support. People who knew my work, clients who had praised me publicly, even 2 former VPs who had left the company and now felt safe enough to say, "We believe you." One even wrote, I knew something shady was happening every January, I just didn't have the guts to speak up. I wasn't surprised when I got the call from Rachel Lynn, an investigative journalist at The Verge Business. She had been tipped off, not by me, but by someone inside the firm. A quiet ally who didn't want to be named but had read my legal filing and decided enough was enough. Rachel asked for a quote, and I gave her one I knew would hit like a thunderclap. They didn't just fire me to save money. They fired me to make an example, and now I'm making one of them. When the article dropped, everything changed. The headline? Top female exec sues former firm over bonus suppression scheme, could trigger broader legal fallout. Within hours, the story was trending on LinkedIn and X. Within days, it was cited on legal blogs, picked up by Business Insider, and whispered across every boardroom that knew the Stanton and Lowell name. The firm went into damage control mode. HR sent out internal reminders about confidentiality and professionalism. Their legal team offered to settle again, this time quietly, with a non-disclosure agreement and a six-figure offer. I didn't even hesitate. I said no. Not unless it came with a full admission of fault and policy change commitments in writing. They balked, of course. Companies like that are allergic to accountability. But what they didn't realize was that I didn't need their money anymore. The media exposure had opened up everything. I had job offers from 2 competitors, multiple speaking invitations, and even a consulting gig with a firm that wanted to audit toxic executive structures. But I wasn't finished yet. Not by a long shot. Layla and I prepared for full litigation. We scheduled depositions. One by one, key players from my old department were subpoenaed. Daniel tried to evade his, but that only made him look worse. Erin, to her credit, showed up. Under oath, she admitted there had been pressure to reduce end-of-year expenses, and yes, bonus delays and terminations had been discussed together. That sentence alone nearly sank their whole defense. My favorite moment? When one of the junior analysts, someone I barely knew, testified that she overheard HR call the annual terminations bonus dodges. Layla raised an eyebrow and asked, "Was that term used more than once?" The girl nodded. Every year. I could feel the tides shifting. Stanton and Lowell weren't just losing control of the narrative, they were losing credibility with the very investors and clients they had once bragged about landing under my leadership. Karma, as it turns out, wears a blazer. The night before our next court date, I sat alone in my apartment with a glass of wine and read through every email I'd ever sent to that company. I wasn't bitter anymore. I was something more dangerous, clear. I thought of Nina, of the 14 other women who'd been pushed out, of the interns who would join corporate America believing their value came with an expiration date. Not if I had anything to say about it. The next morning, we walked into the courthouse with fire in our eyes and facts in our hands. The courtroom was cold, sterile, humming with quiet tension. As I sat beside Layla at the plaintiff's table, I took in the sight of Stanton and Lowell's legal army, 3 suited men and 1 woman, huddled together with the kind of nervous energy only the truly guilty exude. Their lead counsel, Jeremy Marks, looked exhausted. He knew what was coming. Layla had built our case like an architect constructing a skyscraper, every claim supported by evidence, every assertion tied to witness testimony, and every potential loophole closed with brutal precision. It wasn't just a wrongful termination case anymore. It was a corporate reckoning. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Judge Rios, didn't even pretend to hide her irritation when Stanton and Lowell's attorneys tried to delay the proceedings again. She leaned forward, peering at them over her glasses, and asked, "How many extensions are you planning to request before addressing the substance of the complaint?" The silence that followed was deafening. Layla smiled slightly, then rose to present our timeline, performance reviews that showed I had exceeded every target, Slack messages where Daniel alluded to keeping Q4 bonuses in check, and my original termination letter, which claimed my firing was due to team restructuring despite the company hiring someone to fill my exact position 3 weeks later. But what really sealed the courtroom that day was the deposition footage. We played the clip of Erin, the HR director, under oath admitting that upper management had discussed delaying or terminating bonus-eligible employees for budget purposes. The video showed her nervously twisting her bracelet, swallowing hard, and saying, "Yes, those conversations happened, more than once." Gasps fluttered across the courtroom like wine through dry leaves. Judge Rios paused the video and turned to their counsel. "Is this your idea of restructuring? Because from where I sit, this looks like targeted financial suppression." And just like that, their last defense cracked. The real explosion came 3 days later, when The Verge Business published a follow-up exposé titled, "The Bonus Purge: How a Prestigious Firm Quietly Fired Dozens of Women to Cut Costs." My story was the lead, but it wasn't just about me anymore. The article included interviews with 8 of the other women I had helped organize, some anonymous, some bold enough to go on record. It detailed how Stanton and Lowell systematically culled female talent every year between December and January, saving millions in unpaid bonuses. One section quoted a former board member who admitted off the record, "We knew it was risky, but it was efficient." Efficient. That word echoed in my ears as headlines exploded across the financial world. Clients pulled out of deals. An international investor group suspended its ongoing negotiations with the firm. Their LinkedIn followers plummeted. Female employees posted vague but telling statuses like, "Now everyone sees what we saw on the inside." I didn't need to keep tabs, my phone buzzed every hour with another ping of validation. And then came the moment I knew we'd truly won. Daniel Hastings, the man who once called me replaceable, resigned to pursue other opportunities. Translation? He was forced out before the board could vote to fire him publicly. The same man who engineered my removal was now the face of the firm's disgrace. When Layla called me with the final offer, it wasn't a settlement, it was a surrender. Stanton and Lowell proposed a full public apology, a $2.4 million payout, triple my bonus, with legal fees, and a signed agreement to implement structural reforms in how year-end evaluations and terminations were handled. The NDA clause was gone, I had insisted on that. My silence was never for sale. They knew they couldn't bury me anymore. The only question now was whether I would accept that victory, or take it further. I took a long walk through Central Park that evening, thinking about it. I passed joggers, tourists, and a few people who smiled at me with faint recognition, probably from the article or the LinkedIn threads. The money, as massive as it was, no longer excited me. What I wanted most was justice, not just for me, but for the next Camille who'd walk into a boardroom with ambition in her veins and excellence in her stride, only to be told she was too expensive to keep around after doing everything right. I called Layla from a bench beneath a sycamore tree. "We accept," I said, voice calm but steel-lined. "But I want the apology to be posted on their official website, not buried in a press release." She paused, then said, "Already handled. You'll see it tomorrow." And I did. In large font, across the Stanton and Lowell homepage, "We acknowledge and apologize. Our past practices around year-end terminations were wrong. We are committed to change." It went viral. Again. By the end of the week, I'd been approached by 2 business schools to speak about ethical leadership, 3 venture firms asking if I'd join as a partner, and 1 Women in Tech Alliance offering to sponsor a mentorship program if I launched it. All because I refused to be silenced. Because I chose to burn the ladder they kicked me off and build an elevator instead. And somewhere, I hoped Daniel was watching. Watching the woman he underestimated stand taller than he ever could, not just with a win, but with a legacy. I never planned on becoming a public figure, but the fallout from the lawsuit made anonymity impossible. The moment Stanton and Lowell posted their apology, my inbox exploded with invitations, interviews, and messages from women across the country. Some were fresh graduates terrified of what awaited them in the corporate world. Others were seasoned professionals who had faced the exact same restructuring I had, different companies, same rotten playbook. They weren't just congratulating me. They were thanking me. For not backing down. For making it public. For saying what they couldn't. I knew then that winning the lawsuit wasn't the end. It was the beginning. I spent the next 6 months meeting with leaders from advocacy groups, former colleagues, labor lawyers, and corporate ethics consultants. Not as a client this time, but as a founder. That summer, I launched Verity Collective, a nonprofit legal and advocacy organization dedicated to exposing gender-based corporate manipulation, especially around bonuses, maternity leave retaliation, and wrongful terminations. The name came from the Latin word for truth, because that's what companies feared most. I wasn't alone. The 8 other women who had stepped forward with me all joined as contributors, offering mentorship, resources, and even legal referrals. Layla, my fierce and brilliant lawyer, became Verity's legal director. She joked that we had gone from client and attorney to co-conspirators in a war against systemic gaslighting. We were. And the movement was real. By the end of the year, Verity had already helped 25 women file lawsuits. Not all of them made headlines, but 6 ended in landmark settlements, and 1 prompted a full-blown investigation into a Fortune 100 tech company. We weren't just helping women fight back. We were building a reputation that made companies rethink retaliation before they even considered it. Meanwhile, I returned to the world I knew best, strategy and brand development. Only this time, I wasn't working for anyone else. I launched Cambridge Brand Partners, named not for any Ivy League aspirations, but after my grandmother, Camille Bridges, who raised me to believe that silence was not grace, and grace was not weakness. My firm focused on helping women and minority-owned businesses scale with confidence and resilience. In the first quarter, we hit 6 figures in revenue. In the second, we doubled it. But I think what gave me the most joy was the mentorship program we rolled out through Verity. We called it Keep Your Seat, inspired by all the boardroom tables where women had been told to wait their turn or were quietly removed before they could earn their rightful place. The pilot paired 20 young professionals with seasoned female leaders in finance, marketing, and law. We didn't just teach negotiation tactics, we trained women to see corporate patterns, to track every email, to document every backhanded comment masked as a joke. We trained them to be warriors in heels and headphones. Every once in a while, I'd hear a whisper about Stanton and Lowell. Their stock had taken a permanent hit. 3 senior partners had resigned under pressure. And while they never named me publicly, I knew I had become the cautionary tale for HR departments across the country. Don't mess with Camille Hartley. She fights clean, but she hits hard. One evening, about a year after the trial ended, I sat on a panel at Columbia Business School. The moderator, a sharp young professor with fire in her voice, asked me, "What do you say to people who claim you were just chasing a payout?" I smiled, leaned into the mic, and said, "If I wanted a payout, I'd have taken the first settlement offer." I wasn't chasing money. I was chasing accountability. And I caught it. The room erupted in applause. And later that night, as I walked out into the cool Manhattan air, I realized I hadn't just survived corporate betrayal. I had rewritten the narrative. I had turned their silence into my spotlight. Their greed into my growth. Their insult into my influence. They fired me to save a bonus. I built a movement worth millions. And I never looked back.